In 1953, the President of the United States made a deal with a fascist dictator the world had spent 8 years trying to isolate. No NATO membership. No treaty ratified by Congress. Just 3 quiet executive agreements signed in a Madrid palace, and suddenly, American bombers had a home 1 flight away from the Soviet Union's southern shadow. Why would Washington embrace the man who had armed Hitler's tanks and sent troops to fight beside the Wehrmacht? The answer lies on a map, a peninsula jutting into the Atlantic, guarding the gate to the Mediterranean, sitting just 9 miles from Africa. This is the story of how Spain, the pariah of post-war Europe, became one of the most strategically indispensable pieces on the Cold War chessboard, and what that bargain cost everyone involved. The story of Spain's strategic value to the United States does not begin in 1953. It begins in the rubble of 1945, with a contradiction that would define the next decade of American foreign policy. A nation built on the rhetoric of democracy needed friends, and one of the most useful friends available was a man who had spent the Spanish Civil War crushing democracy with German bombers and Italian rifles. Francisco Franco had won that war in 1939 with direct military assistance from Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. During the Second World War that followed, Franco never formally joined the Axis, but his sympathies were never in doubt. He signed friendship agreements with Berlin, sold Spain's strategic minerals, tungsten above all, to the German war machine, and dispatched the so-called Blue Division, tens of thousands of Spanish volunteers, to fight and die alongside German forces on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. When the war ended and the Allies divided the world into victors and the condemned, Spain belonged, in the eyes of Washington, London, and Paris, firmly in the second category. The punishment was swift and humiliating. In December 1946, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution declaring Franco's government a threat to international peace, and it recommended that member states withdraw their ambassadors from Madrid entirely. France sealed its border. Spain was excluded from the Marshall Plan, the enormous American Reconstruction program that was rebuilding the rest of Western Europe. When the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded in 1949 to bind the democracies of the West into a single defensive shield against Soviet expansion, Spain was left outside the wall, deliberately and pointedly. France and Britain in particular would not tolerate sitting at the same table as a dictator they had so recently fought against by proxy. Franco's Spain was, for a brief moment in history, almost entirely alone. And yet alone is not the same as irrelevant. Even as the diplomatic doors closed, a handful of American strategists were quietly studying a map of Europe and noticing something uncomfortable. NATO's defensive line, however morally satisfying, had a geographic problem. If Soviet tanks ever rolled across the North German plain, the alliance's plan for a worst-case scenario involved an orderly fallback, and there were limited places in Western Europe still standing far enough from the front to serve as a final redoubt. The Iberian Peninsula, tucked behind the Pyrenees, untouched by the war's destruction, was one of the only land masses in Western Europe that a retreating force could realistically use to regroup, resupply, and counterattack. This was the seed of everything that followed. Spain's value was never about ideology. It was about geography, and geography does not care who is sitting in the presidential palace. The first cracks in the wall of isolation appeared by late 1947. President Harry Truman, increasingly consumed by the emerging Cold War, began speaking not in terms of fascism versus democracy but in terms of the free world versus what he now called a communist dictatorship. That rhetorical shift mattered enormously. It reframed the entire calculus of who counted as an acceptable partner. In November of that year, American diplomats worked to block a renewed UN condemnation of Franco's government, quietly signaling that Washington's patience for moral consistency was thinning. Within months, France reopened its border. Trade and financial agreements followed with both France and Britain by the summer of 1948. The wall was not yet gone, but it had a door in it, and someone in Washington was holding it open. The event that finally tore the door off its hinges was not European at all. It was Korean. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, the Cold War stopped being a tense standoff and became, in the minds of American planners, an active shooting war that could erupt again anywhere along the Soviet periphery. Containment was no longer a theory to be debated in faculty lounges and State Department memos. It was an urgent operational requirement. And operational requirements do not wait for ideological purity tests. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who had built much of America's early Cold War architecture, supported a United Nations resolution at the end of 1950 that lifted the ban on diplomatic recognition of Franco's government. American economic credits began flowing into Spain almost immediately afterward. By 1951, formal negotiations had begun for what would eventually become a full mutual defense agreement between the two nations. Spain still could not join NATO. French and British objections remained an immovable obstacle, but a parallel, bilateral relationship was taking shape, one that would give Washington nearly everything the alliance might have offered, without requiring the awkward business of admitting a dictatorship into a club of democracies. What Spain offered, stripped of all the diplomatic language, was airspace and seabed. The Iberian Peninsula sat astride the western mouth of the Mediterranean, controlling, alongside British Gibraltar, the choke point through which any naval power would need to pass to move between the Atlantic and southern Europe. It offered the Atlantic-facing ports the U.S. Navy needed to refuel and resupply a fleet operating far from American shores. And it offered something that mattered intensely to the new doctrine of strategic air power: distance from Soviet bomber range, combined with proximity to the Mediterranean basin, North Africa, and the Middle East, regions where American planners increasingly believed the next crisis was likely to erupt. There was also a darker, more clinical layer to the planning. In the event of all-out war with the Soviet Union, the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs of Staff viewed Spanish bases as essential to an orderly fallback for American and NATO forces if the Red Army overran Central Europe. Spain, untouched and stable, could become a staging ground from which the West might eventually counterattack. It was an unglamorous, almost bureaucratic kind of value, not the value of an ally who shares your principles, but the value of a piece of real estate that happens to sit exactly where your war plans need it to. By the time formal negotiations opened in the early 1950s, the United States was not approaching Spain as a supplicant looking for friends. It was approaching Spain the way a buyer approaches a seller who happens to own the only available lot on a strategic street corner. Franco, isolated and starved of legitimacy for nearly a decade, understood his position just as clearly. He had something Washington needed. The only question left was the price, and how each side would justify the transaction to a watching world that had not forgotten what Francoist Spain represented only a few years earlier. If geography explained why the United States wanted Spain, the Korean War explained why it could no longer afford to wait. By 1951, American and Spanish negotiators were meeting regularly, and the shape of the eventual bargain was becoming clear. Spain would offer land, Washington would offer money and weapons, and both sides would carefully avoid calling it what it actually was: a military alliance with a dictatorship that NATO itself refused to admit. The negotiations dragged for 2 years, slowed by haggling over money, sovereignty, and the precise legal status of the American presence on Spanish soil. Madrid wanted to be treated as something more than a landlord renting out real estate. Washington wanted maximum operational freedom at minimum political cost. The compromise that emerged reflected both sides' anxieties almost perfectly. On September 26, 1953, inside the Palace of Santa Cruz in Madrid, American Ambassador James Clement Dunn and Spanish Foreign Minister Alberto Martín Artejo put their signatures on what would become known as the Pact of Madrid, though in form it was not one agreement but three separate executive agreements, deliberately structured to avoid the political ordeal of a formal treaty. That structural choice was not an accident, it was the entire point. A formal treaty would have required ratification by 2/3 of the United States Senate, an open debate that President Dwight Eisenhower had every reason to dread. American public opinion toward Franco remained deeply unfavorable, and forcing a public vote on legitimizing his regime risked a humiliating defeat or, at minimum, a bruising fight Eisenhower did not need. Executive agreements required no such vote. They could be negotiated, signed, and implemented entirely within the authority of the presidency, and if circumstances ever changed, they could be dismantled far more easily than a ratified treaty. Eisenhower got nearly all the strategic benefit of a binding alliance while sidestepping almost all of the domestic political risk. The substance of the three agreements broke down with deliberate precision. The first dealt with the direct provision of American war material to the Spanish armed forces. The second addressed economic aid, including loans intended to help modernize an economy still crippled by Franco's isolationist policies of the 1940s. The third, and by far the most consequential, was the Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement, the document that authorized the construction and joint use of American military bases on Spanish territory. The language of that base agreement was carefully worded to protect Spanish sovereignty on paper. It stated that the Spanish government was authorizing the United States to develop and use designated areas, jointly with the government of Spain, and that the bases would technically fly the Spanish flag. In practice, the operational reality looked very different. The United States retained exclusive day-to-day control over the facilities it built, including, according to later historical accounts, the handling of any nuclear weapons that might eventually be stationed there. A secret clause, not disclosed publicly at the time, allowed American forces to use the bases in the event of a wider war without obligating the United States to provide reciprocal defense guarantees for Spain itself, meaning that if Spain were attacked, say over its colonial disputes in North Africa, there was no automatic guarantee that Washington would come to its aid. The relationship, as one Spanish historian would later put it bluntly, made Spain a strategic satellite of the United States rather than a true ally. The numbers attached to the deal were enormous for an economy as battered as Spain's. Over the following decade, the United States would funnel something in the range of $1.4 billion in combined military and economic assistance into the country. By some estimates, including longer-term loans and investment, the total support exceeded $1 billion in direct aid alone. American equipment began arriving by the truckload: Patton and Chaffee tanks, Walker Bulldog light tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, and naval modernization packages that refitted aging Spanish destroyers, frigates, and submarines with American-designed systems. Spain's Air Force and Navy, starved of modern hardware since the Civil War, suddenly found themselves equipped with the tools of a Cold War power, even if their freedom to use that hardware remained tightly bound to Washington's wishes. 5 major installations anchored the new American presence. Naval facilities at Rota, on Spain's southwestern Atlantic coast near the mouth of the Strait of Gibraltar, gave the U.S. Navy a deep water port from which submarines and surface ships could operate across the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. Air bases at Torrejon, near Madrid, at Moron, in the south, and at Zaragoza, in the northeast, gave Strategic Air Command a network of fields from which long-range bombers could reach virtually any target in the southern Soviet Union or the Middle East without first crossing through more politically sensitive NATO airspace. Together, these installations transformed Spain, almost overnight, from a diplomatic afterthought into one of the most operationally important pieces of American Cold War infrastructure in Europe. For Franco, the symbolism mattered just as much as the hardware. State-controlled Spanish newspapers, particularly the regime mouthpiece Arriba, presented the Pact of Madrid as nothing short of a personal diplomatic triumph for the caudillo himself, the long-awaited vindication of his foreign policy and proof that Spain's incorruptible sovereignty had not been compromised by the deal. One widely circulated anecdote, repeated in the Spanish press, recalled an American senator standing before a map of NATO's member states years earlier and pointing directly at Spain as the glaring gap in Western defense, the strongest point and best base of action that the alliance still lacked. Whether or not the story was embellished for propaganda purposes, it captured precisely the argument Franco's government wanted the Spanish public, and the world, to believe, that Spain had not been rescued by the Americans, but that the Americans had finally come to their senses and recognized what Spain had always known about its own importance. The truth, as is often the case, sat somewhere between the propaganda and the cynicism. Spain had genuinely become strategically indispensable, and Franco had genuinely used that leverage to drag his regime out of total isolation. But the price of that rescue was a relationship in which Spain supplied the land and the loyalty, while the United States retained the real decision-making power, a pattern that would define the alliance for the next 2 decades. The Pact of Madrid did not just rearm Spain. It rehabilitated it. And nowhere was that rehabilitation more visible than at the United Nations, the very institution that had voted in 1946 to treat Franco's government as a threat to world peace. In 1955, less than 2 years after the executive agreements were signed, Spain was admitted as a full member of the United Nations. The timing was no coincidence. American diplomatic support, leveraged directly from the new defense relationship, helped clear the path for Spanish membership as part of a broader package deal that also brought in fascist Portugal, neutral Finland, and a cluster of Soviet-aligned Eastern European states. A grand bargain in which both Cold War blocs agreed to swallow ideological discomfort in exchange for expanding their respective spheres of international legitimacy. For Franco, UN membership was the single most important diplomatic achievement of his entire regime up to that point. It meant the world, however reluctantly, was treating Spain as a normal state again. Around the same time, the United States facilitated Spain's entry into the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and American capital soon made the United States Spain's single largest foreign investor. The economic consequences of this opening would prove, over the following decade and a half, to be more transformative than anyone at the negotiating table in 1953 likely anticipated. The conditions attached to American economic aid forced Franco's government to begin dismantling pieces of its rigid autarkic economic policy, the self-sufficiency doctrine that had kept Spain economically isolated and stagnant since the Civil War. That shift, often described by historians as reluctant and incremental rather than a deliberate embrace of reform, nonetheless helped lay groundwork for the so-called Spanish economic miracle of the 1960s, a period of rapid industrial growth and rising living standards that transformed Spain's cities and, eventually, its tourism-driven coastline. None of this came without friction, and the friction revealed just how unequal the partnership truly was. Spanish military and political figures soon grew frustrated with what one prominent Spanish historian, Julio Gil Pacharaman, later described as treatment by Washington as a junior partner receiving little more than crumbs compared to what NATO members received. The equipment deliveries, while substantial, often arrived slower and in smaller quantities than Spanish officials had hoped, and the secret clauses limiting reciprocal defense guarantees left Spanish strategists keenly aware that their security depended entirely on American goodwill rather than binding obligation. When Spain found itself embroiled in colonial conflicts over Western Sahara and Ifni in North Africa during the 1950s, no American support materialized, a clear signal that the alliance existed to serve anti-communist containment and nothing else. Spain's enemies in Madrid's colonial periphery were not Washington's enemies, and the Pact of Madrid had never promised otherwise. There was domestic opposition inside the United States as well, though it rarely slowed the policy itself. American liberals and progressives, including figures such as former Interior Secretary Harold Ickes, had spent years describing Franco in unsparing terms, at one point calling him a virtual mimic of Hitler whose regime suffocated basic freedoms. Religious objections added another layer of criticism, particularly from American Protestant communities troubled by the Concordat Franco's government signed with the Vatican in August 1953, just weeks before the base agreements, which formally restricted the public expression of non-Catholic religious teaching inside Spain. Critics argued that Washington was not merely tolerating an authoritarian regime for strategic convenience but actively financing the entrenchment of religious intolerance and political repression as the price of a few airfields. These criticisms rarely found traction at the policy level, because the strategic logic driving the relationship had not weakened, it had only deepened. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the bases at Torrejon, Moron, and Zaragoza became increasingly central to American strategic air planning, while Rota expanded into a key logistics and submarine support hub for naval operations stretching across the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic. Spain's bases gave Strategic Air Command bombers a forward position with reach into the southern Soviet Union and the Middle East that bases in France, Germany, or Britain simply could not replicate from the same angle, and they gave the U.S. Navy a resupply and repair point far closer to the Mediterranean and African theaters than any port in the British Isles. By 1963, when the original 10-year agreements came up for renewal, the strategic calculus had shifted again. France, under Charles de Gaulle, was steadily distancing itself from full integration in NATO's military command structure, eventually expelling American and NATO forces from French soil by the end of the decade. As French bases became less available and less reliable for American planning, Spain's value as an alternative, stable, dependably anti-communist platform only increased. Each renewal negotiation between Washington and Madrid through the 1960s and into the 1970s followed roughly the same pattern established in 1953. Spain offered continuity and geography, the United States offered money and equipment, and the underlying question of full NATO membership for Spain remained politically untouchable as long as Franco himself remained in power. The bargain, in other words, had become self-reinforcing. The very dictatorship that made Spain's NATO membership impossible was also the dictatorship that guaranteed Spain's unwavering, uncomplicated reliability as an anti-communist partner, no parliament to second-guess Franco's foreign policy, no opposition party capable of demanding troop withdrawals, no electoral risk of a government shift toward neutrality. For American strategists focused purely on operational reliability, this was, in its own cold way, an advantage. For ordinary Spaniards living under nearly 4 decades of authoritarian rule, it was a continuation of exactly the conditions the rest of the democratic world had once claimed it would never tolerate. By the time Francisco Franco died in November 1975, the bargain struck in 1953 had outlived its original architect by decades of continued relevance, and the question facing both Washington and Madrid was no longer whether the relationship had value, but whether it could survive the transition to a different kind of Spain. The answer, in the end, was yes, but the relationship itself had to be fundamentally rebuilt. As Spain moved through its delicate transition to democracy in the late 1970s, the old executive agreement signed by a dictator could no longer serve as the foundation for a partnership with a parliamentary government. In 1976, a new treaty of friendship and cooperation replaced the original Pact of Madrid framework, and critically, this version required ratification by an increasingly assertive Spanish parliament rather than existing purely as an executive arrangement between a president and a strongman. The asymmetries that had defined the 1953 relationship, secret clauses, no reciprocal defense guarantee, minimal Spanish input into how the bases were actually used, became politically untenable almost overnight once Spanish voters and elected representatives had a say. The most significant transformation came in 1982, when democratic Spain finally joined NATO, the alliance it had been locked out of for more than 3 decades because of the very dictatorship that had once made American bases there necessary in the first place. The irony was almost too neat. The strategic value that had justified propping up Franco's regime through billions of dollars in aid was the same value that, once Spain became a democracy, allowed it to walk through the front door of the alliance instead of remaining a quiet bilateral arrangement on the outside. Spanish membership in NATO was not without domestic controversy. A 1986 referendum on continued membership passed only after the government of Felipe González campaigned hard to convince a skeptical public, many of whom still associated the American military relationship with the indignities of the Franco years. The American bases themselves did not disappear with democratization, they evolved. Rota remained, and remains today, one of the most important naval and logistics installations the United States operates outside its own borders, a continued waypoint for American naval power projecting into the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and increasingly, in recent decades, supporting operations related to ballistic missile defense for NATO's European members. Moron Air Base similarly persisted as a key logistics and staging hub, particularly valuable for American operations in Africa and the broader Mediterranean theater. Torrejon, by contrast, gradually transitioned away from a primarily American military role and toward greater integration with Spanish civilian and military aviation infrastructure as the original Cold War mission evolved. Stepping back from the granular history, the strategic logic that drove Washington's calculations in 1953 has aged with a kind of uncomfortable durability. Spain's position at the gateway between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, its proximity to North Africa, and its distance from the traditional Central European battlefields made it valuable to American planners worried about a Soviet invasion of Germany. Those exact same geographic features made it valuable decades later for entirely different missions: counterterrorism logistics, naval operations in the Mediterranean, and rapid deployment capability toward the Middle East and North Africa during conflicts that no 1950s planner could have specifically predicted, even if the underlying logic of Spain sits where American power needs to project remained essentially unchanged. Historians continue to debate how to weigh the moral cost of the original bargain against its strategic results. Scholars such as Paul Preston, one of Franco's most prominent biographers, have generally argued that American support functioned as a critical lifeline that helped Franco's dictatorship survive years longer than it might have otherwise, given how thoroughly economically and diplomatically isolated the regime had been before 1953. Other historians place more emphasis on the broader Cold War context, arguing that nearly every major power engaged in similarly uncomfortable alliances of convenience during this period, and that judging the Spain-US relationship in isolation risks ignoring how routine this kind of moral compromise actually was across the entire Cold War order. What is not seriously disputed is the basic strategic fact at the center of the story: Spain's geography made it valuable to the United States regardless of who governed it, and the government that happened to be in power in 1953 was simply positioned to cash in on that value first. The deeper lesson embedded in this history extends well beyond Spain itself. Strategic value, in the calculus of great powers, is rarely about shared values at all. It is about coastlines, airspace, distance from adversaries, and proximity to crisis zones. Franco understood this with brutal clarity, and he leveraged Spain's location to drag his isolated, internationally despised regime back into the community of nations, almost entirely on the strength of latitude and longitude rather than legitimacy. The United States, for its part, demonstrated with equal clarity that ideological consistency would always yield to operational necessity whenever the map demanded it. 7 decades later, American forces still operate from Spanish soil, a living reminder that geography, far more than any treaty or election, has always been the truest currency of strategic alliance.